Thank you. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Dr. Freedhoff, does it make sense to allow chemicals to avoid EPA review where there is equivalency to a chemical that has never been reviewed by EPA?
No.
And if you look at the change in the draft from the standard that the chemical may present unreasonable risk to a standard that it is more likely than not to present unreasonable risk, is there danger that at that stage in the review proceeding there simply isn't enough data yet to make that determination, and that therefore a chemical that may very well be more likely than not to present unreasonable risk won't meet that standard simply because it's a sequencing problem? The question is being asked too early in the data gathering process.
I think that's a possibility, and I think it would be important to ask EPA, how the career scientists, how they would implement that provision should it be enacted.
It would make sense to get rid of that potential anomaly, would it not? So also, the discussion draft sets in review periods. There are placeholders at this stage, but whatever the number is for how long the review period lasts, would it be wise to make sure that the chemicals industry is not in a position where by simply delaying and prevaricating, it can run out the clock on EPA review and get an automatic approval because of its own non-compliance with requests for information or other participation in the review process?
I think any provision that lets chemicals go into commerce before EPA finishes its review takes us back to the 1976 TSCA and doesn't retain the provisions that are supposed to make sure that chemicals are safely made and used before they go into commerce.
And if we set up a process where the proponent of a chemical had the incentive to not comply with EPA process and run out the clock to an approval that was automated, basically, by the clock, that would be an unfortunate outcome and create potentially, it would incentivize some pretty bad behavior.
It could.
You mentioned in your testimony that the scope and implementation requirements included in the draft would need to be simplified and narrowed in order to best set EPA up for success, a problem that is made worse by Senator Padilla's comments, not made worse by his comments, but made worse by the subject of his comments, that there simply isn't adequate staff. It's been cut back at EPA, and so when you burden a shrunk staff, you end up diminishing the authority and the scope of the ability of EPA to move forward. You then go on to say that we adopted policies and approaches when you were at EPA that greatly sped up the review of some types of new chemicals without sacrificing safety, and you recommend that there is more along these lines that could be done. In my remaining minute, could you make some recommendations as to what more along these lines could be done? And could you take the remainder of that question as a question for the record, so you can, at your appropriate length, respond in writing to what more at length could be done?
Sure. I mean, when, during the Biden administration, we really prioritized getting the chemicals that the semiconductor sector needed into commerce more quickly. And so first, we prioritized those chemistries for review so that we had limited resources. We had to prioritize something. So we ended up reviewing semiconductor chemistries in about a third the time as compared to the other length of reviews. We also really focused the agency's scientific scientific energy on creating standardized and streamlined reviews for semiconductor chemistry. So there's some types of semiconductor chemicals that are reviewed in under 90 days still. I think there's more the agency could do that way. They could, find science policies that let them not reinvent the wheel every single time a new chemical comes into the system, but draws on lessons learned from past reviews to help speed things up.
Similarity, if not equivalency.
Yes.
Yes, yield to Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. It was very